on earth can we provide safe service and safe staffing levels? People can't even afford to pay to get into work.
It's an idea that's been around in conservative circles for a long time, and it's coming to fruition in a much more wide-ranging and much more radical form.
Strikes have become a part of life here in the UK this winter, but the government has planned to reduce the disruption. Surging inflation means workers are staging walkouts in increasing numbers as unions fight with employers to get pay rises that match the rising cost of living. The government is bringing in new legislation it hopes will blunt the impact these strikes are having. But why has it proven so controversial? Let's head over to Westminster to find out more.
The British people need to know that when they have a heart attack, a stroke or a serious injury, that an ambulance will turn up. And that if they need hospital care, they have access to it. And that's because they need to know that not only are those services available, but they're able to get trains and buses, particularly for those who are most likely to be the least well off in society.
iPolitical editor Hugo Jai has been following the bill since his front page story alerted many to this major change in the right to strike. We've heard Mr. Shapps explain what he hopes the bill will achieve, but what's actually in it?
So what's in the bill is a change to the law on when individual workers are allowed to go on strike. At the moment, if you go on strike as part of an organised union that has had a legally valid vote, your employer can't punish you or sack you or take any retribution against you for going out on strike. What this bill does is it gives employers the right to determine a minimum number of staff to come in even during a strike in these sectors that it applies to. So essentially, even if you're part of a union that's voted to go on strike, an employer will be able to put you on a list of people and say that actually you can't go on strike. And so then if you do take industrial action, then they can take retribution against you. They can potentially fire you.
This ability for bosses to force striking employees back into work only applies to the 6 key sectors you can see on the screen, but it has provoked huge backlash. Hugo explains why.
What makes this legislation contentious is that it's seen by the unions and by some union activists as a fundamental undermining of the right to strike, which is something that's contained in a lot of human rights legislation, international agreements and so on. The idea is that if employers have the right under certain circumstances to say to individual workers, if you go on strike, you will be fired. That runs counter to the idea that we've had in this country for a long time, that actually, as long as a union follows the law on when a strike is valid, then any worker that's a member of that union can go out on strike on the specified dates with no retribution. The government's response to that is that minimum service levels do exist in other countries. It's not a totally new idea.
And it's not totally unheard of in the British economy either. There is one group of workers who already can't fully walk out.
For the other sectors covered in the bill, we hope to reach minimum service agreements that mean that we don't have to use that power in the bill, and they will be able to come to that position just as the nurses have done in the recent strikes.
Thanks to an existing piece of legislation from 1992, nurses run a so-called life and limb service during industrial action. But the nurses on the pickets at the recent strikes in London point out a key problem with legislating to maintain safe staffing levels on strike days.
Every day there's unsafe staffing on our wards. Every single day patients don't get the care that they deserve. Not because we don't want to, but because there aren't enough of us.
Minimum staffing, I get that, but at the end of the day we're working on far less than that on a day-to-day basis, and there's no consideration or no care being given there. So actually, why aren't we having that conversation about the day-to-day? Us being on strike today actually isn't changing things inside those doors.
Hugo says the question of what constitutes safe staffing levels is one of the holes in the bill that is causing concern, but could also reveal the government's intentions.
I think one of the many unanswered questions about this bill is actually how will it work in practice. For example, the bill does not define what an acceptable minimum service is for any of these sectors. It kicks that can down the road. It says it's a matter for consultation. Ministers are saying that for some sectors, the legal provisions that are in this bill might never even take effect at all. They're going to prioritise the railways, ambulances and fire services. They say they definitely will do that by the end of this year. But beyond that, it may never apply to education, to nurses, to border force. So it's not going to be easy to enforce this. You can imagine a lot of legal challenges. How will that be dealt with? It's totally unclear. The bill as drafted doesn't specify. What's clear is that for now, this is more of a negotiating tactic by the government and more of a political signal that they're willing to be tough on the unions than it is a practical tool. It won't have an effect on the strikes for this winter. It won't become law quickly enough. The required consultations it contains won't be carried out quickly enough for the current wave of strikes. It does serve as a political signal for the future that the government is doing all it can to curb union power, to ensure that strikes have their effect limited.
So, will this gambit work politically? Polling data has shown the public's view on many of the strikes tend to be favourable. But that isn't without nuance and is changing as the strikes wear on. Let's hear from a few members of the public.
Well, part of me thinks we should all come out on strike and just make a big hit on this, because that's the fastest way to get politicians to listen.
I am a Tory supporter myself, but I think there are certain things that Tories can do that are better that the government can do.
And I cannot understand why the government cannot just simply pay them something reasonable compared to what they've been suffering for the last few years. And we're not talking about management now, we're talking about nurses actually on the front line.
Do you mind me asking how you feel about the other strikes, so for teachers?
I'm not particularly invested in those. I mean, I think obviously there's a certain sense of people jumping on the bandwagon, but the nurses are something completely separate, and the government should realise that.
So, some members of the public see strikes in certain sectors differently. Is this widespread? Polls appear to show this is the case. Hugo says, if the government plans to exploit these divides for political gain, it risks coming up against one of the trade union movement's founding principles.
There's no doubt that the public and the government see different strikes in a slightly different way. Polls suggest there's overwhelming public support for striking nurses, for example, whereas voters are much more divided on the railways or the Royal Mail. So it's not surprising that the government is to some extent trying to draw a bit of a wedge between them, a bit of a distinction between them, say, well, actually we've been able to work well with the nursing unions and not so well with the rail unions. The problem there for the government is, if there's one thing that trade unions tend historically to be good at, it's solidarity. That is the watchword of the trade union movement. For trade union leaders, it seems unlikely that, for example, the leaders of the nursing unions are going to stop being supportive of trade union solidarity as a whole. The government's been trying for some time, they've been hanging on for some time, these divisions to emerge and the workers who are out on strike to become essentially tired of being on strike and tired of losing out financially. It's not worked so far. Who knows what's going to happen in future, but ministers possibly would be foolish to put all their eggs in that basket.